Welcome back, everyone, to the Book Triangle podcast.
Great to be with you again.
We're picking up right where we left off in our Navigating Modern India series.
That's right. And our mission, as always, is helping you get to grips with the core insights from historical sources.
Exactly. Making complex history clear, engaging, whether you're prepping for exams, studying, or, just curious about how modern India came to be.
We try to cut through the noise, synthesize things, give you those aha moments without getting bogged down. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding the big forces at play.
And today, we are tackling a really pivotal time, Unit 6, Chapter 12 in the Spectrum Modern India book, focusing on the era of militant nationalism, specifically 1905 to 1909.
It's a crucial period. We'll be looking at what really ignited this more assertive form of nationalism.
We'll definitely unpack the Swadeshi and Boycott movement, huge landmark there.
Yeah, and the split in the Congress, which had major consequences, plus how the British government reacted, including the Morley-Minto Reforms.
So by the end of our discussion today, you should have a really solid grasp of the key players, the changing policies, the protests, everything that shaped this transformative era.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start right at the beginning. Why? Why did this militant form of nationalism suddenly surge around this time? What shifted?
That's the perfect place to start, because it wasn't just one thing, right? It was a buildup of several powerful factors coming together, creating this mood of discontent, but also, importantly, a growing sense of self-assertion.
Okay.
And maybe the most fundamental shift was in how Indians were starting to see British rule itself.
That aha moment of exploitation you mentioned earlier. So it wasn't just asking for more rights within the system.
No, exactly. It went deeper. It was this growing realization that the system itself was inherently exploitative, not benevolent like the British claimed.
Right, the whole civilizing mission narrative.
Precisely. For a long time, they'd pushed that idea of bringing order, progress, education. But around the turn of the 20th century, that illusion really started to crack for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay.
The Spectrum book highlights this really well. People started seeing that British rule wasn't designed for India's benefit, but for Britain's economic and political gain.
So even things that looked okay on the surface, like education or administration.
Yeah, they were increasingly seen as tools for control, for extracting resources. Indians began to realize that far from getting more rights, the British were often actively chipping away at the few rights they already had.
Wow. That must have been a huge blow to the British moral authority.
Absolutely. That whole ideological dominance they tried to maintain, it started to crumble. The civilizing mission story just wasn't holding up against the economic and political realities people were seeing.
And I guess that ties into the next point, this growing sense of self-confidence, self-respect among Indians. Education must have played a massive part there.
Oh, definitely. The spread of modern education, ironically, something the British initiated to create loyal clerks, kind of backfired on them.
How so?
Well, more education meant greater awareness, not just of India's own rich history and traditions, but also of, how things worked elsewhere in the world. And it made the realities of being subjugated feel even more stark, more humiliating.
Right.
And this growing dignity was really boosted by the groundwork laid by earlier nationalist thinkers.
Yeah.
People like Dadapai Naoroji.
The grand old man of India.
Exactly. Him, M.G. Ranade, R.C. Dutt, even Guckley to an extent, they provided this really detailed economic critique of British rule.
The drain of wealth theory, right?
Yes, precisely. They showed, with evidence, how India's wealth was being systematically drained away to Britain, making India poorer. This wasn't just, angry shouting. It was a reasoned, evidence-based argument.
Gave people a solid basis to challenge the British narrative.
It really did. It empowered the educated class, gave them the intellectual ammunition and the moral standing to challenge colonial rule with this newfound self-respect.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me, the global context. It wasn't just internal factors. Events happening outside India apparently played a big role in shattering this myth of European supremacy.
Oh, absolutely. This shows how interconnected history is. Events far away had a huge psychological impact in India. They really started to dismantle this idea that European powers were just inherently superior, invincible.
Like Japan's rise.
Japan is the prime example. Here was an Asian nation rapidly industrializing, modernizing. And then, bam, in 1905, they defeat Russia, a major European empire, in a war.
That must have sent shockwaves.
Huge shockwaves, especially across Asia. It was this profound revelation. An Asian country, one considered backward by Western standards, could not only compete with, but actually defeat a major European power. Gave immense inspiration, immense hope.
Yeah, I can imagine. Proof that colonial rule wasn't some fixed destiny.
Exactly. It showed that European dominance wasn't inevitable. And there were other examples, too. Well, Abyssinia, Ethiopia successfully fought off an Italian invasion back in 1896, an African nation resisting European colonialism.
Right.
And even the British themselves faced setbacks. The Boer Wars in South Africa from 1899 to 1902. The mighty British Empire got seriously bogged down fighting the Afrikaners.
Revealing cracks in the imperial facade.
Definitely. So you combine these events with the inspiration from other nationalist movements bubbling up around the world, Ireland, Egypt, Persia.
It all feeds into this growing belief
that Indians, too, could challenge their rulers, that they had the capacity, the right. That psychological barrier of European superiority was really starting to crumble.
So you've got this rising self-confidence, a clearer picture of exploitation, inspiration from abroad. It makes sense that people started getting impatient with the older, moderate approach to nationalism.
Absolutely. The younger generation especially felt deeply frustrated. The Spectrum source uses the term political mendicancy to describe how they saw the moderates' methods.
Mendicancy, like begging.
Essentially, yes. Always relying on the 3 Ps, prayer, petition, and protest. Constantly appealing to British justice, hoping for concessions, waiting patiently.
And after 15, 20 years of the Congress doing that?
There was this widespread feeling that, well, what had it actually achieved? Very little in terms of concrete results. So you had this deep frustration building up, especially among the more radical younger nationalists. They felt these polite constitutional methods just weren't cutting it.
It's like asking nicely over and over and getting nowhere. Eventually you think, maybe I need a totally different strategy.
Precisely that sentiment. And it was amplified by this strong reaction against what they saw as increasing westernization.
How did that play into it?
Well, the new leadership felt there was this colonial agenda to kind of submerge India's own identity within the British Empire, this stranglehold of excessive westernization, as they called it.
So a fear of losing Indian culture.
Yes, a deep apprehension. And it triggered this really passionate push to reconnect with India's own cultural roots, its own history, seeing it as a vital defense against this cultural imposition.
Which connects back to those thinkers who were glorifying India's past.
Exactly. People like Swami Vivekananda asserting the strength of Eastern spirituality. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, whose novel Anandamath and the hymn Bande Mataram became incredibly powerful nationalist symbols.
And Swami Dayananda Saraswati.
Yes, founder of the Arya Samaj. They all presented India's past in a much more positive light than the British often did. They countered the myth of Western superiority by highlighting the richness of Indian civilization. Dayananda's message was potent. India for the Indians.
So it wasn't just nostalgia, it was a call for cultural self-assertion.
A rallying cry, yeah. Reclaiming national pride, resisting cultural assimilation.
Okay, so we have all these underlying currents simmering, and then comes Lord Curzon as viceroy. It seems like his time in charge, 1899 to 1905, acted like pouring fuel on the fire.
That's a very good way to put it. His 7-year rule was deeply unpopular. The source calls it a time of missions, commissions, and omissions. And it definitely sparked sharp reactions.
What was it about him? His attitude?
He had this really dismissive view of Indian political aspirations.
Yeah.
He openly refused to even acknowledge India as a nation, called nationalist activities just letting off of gas.
Yeah.
And his derogatory comments about Indian character delivered with such arrogance. It was deeply insulting.
Not exactly winning hearts and minds.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just talk. His administrative actions were just as inflammatory.
Like which ones specifically?
Well, there was the Official Secrets Act in 1904, a serious clampdown on press freedom. Then the Indian Universities Act, also 1904, which was seen as an attempt to tighten government control over education and curb student politics.
Controlling intellectual life.
Right. And the Calcutta Corporation Act of 1899, which reduced the number of elected Indian members, basically disenfranchising them in a major city.
Undermining representation.
But the biggest one, the act that really crystallized opposition and proved the reactionary nature of British rule in many Indian eyes, was the partition of Bengal in 1905.
Ah, yes, the trigger point. Which brings us right to the Swadeshi and Boycott movement, 1905 to 1909. Let's dig into that partition. What was the official reason versus the real motive?
Okay, so officially the British line was purely administrative convenience. Bengal was huge, present-day Bangladesh, Bihar, Odisha, all rolled into one. A massive population, around 78 million people, a center of commerce.
So they argued it was just too big to manage effectively.
That was the justification.
Yeah.
But the real motive, as Curzon's own writings and the historical analysis show, was political. It was classic divide and rule.
How so? What was the political goal?
The real aim was to weaken Bengal because it was the nerve center of Indian nationalism, and crucially, to drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims.
By creating separate regions.
Exactly. By carving out a Muslim-majority East Bengal and a Hindu-majority West Bengal, Curzon hoped to break their unity, making them easier to control. It was seen by Indians as a blatant attack on their growing solidarity.
A direct challenge. So how did the moderates, who were leading Congress then, initially respond? This is around 1903 to 1905.
Well, in that initial phase, the campaign against the partition was led by moderates like Surendranath Banerjee. People called him the father of Indian nationalism.
Right.
Vishnu Kumar Mitra, P.C. Ray. Their approach was typical moderate strategy. Big public meetings, lots of petitions, using newspapers like the Bengali and Sanjivani to protest.
But their goal was limited.
Very limited at that stage. They were focused almost entirely on just getting the partition annulled. They weren't pushing for broader political goals like Swaraj yet. It was still within that framework of constitutional agitation.
But then the extremists stepped up and the whole movement changed gear, didn't it? How did they broaden the goals?
Yes, this is where it really becomes the militant nationalism era. The extremists, Tilak, Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, or Aurobindo Ghosh, they saw the partition not just as a wrong to be undone, but as a symptom of the larger disease of colonial rule.
So they aimed higher.
Much higher. Their ultimate goal was Swaraj, complete self-government. They believed this needed more direct, aggressive action, moving beyond just petitions. They wanted to turn this Bengal-centric protest into a nationwide struggle for self-rule.
Okay, let's break down their program. What were the key elements? What did this new assertive approach look like in practice?
It was quite radical for its time and really laid the blueprint for later movements. First, Boycott and Swadeshi. This was huge. Boycott wasn't just about not buying foreign cloth.
It was broader.
Much broader. Boycotting government schools, courts, services, basically withdrawing cooperation with the colonial state. And Swadeshi was the positive side, promoting indigenous goods, indigenous institutions, build India's own economy, own society. Public burning of foreign cloth became a powerful symbol.
So self-reliance was key. Atma Shakti.
Exactly. That's the second point. Passive resistance. They called for organized defiance, non-cooperation with unjust laws, maybe not fully realized like Gandhi later did, but the idea was there a major shift.
And national education.
Yes. Thirdly, national education. They saw colonial education as producing loyal subjects. So they pushed for national schools, national colleges, free from government control, rooted in Indian culture and needs. The Bengal National College, with Aurobindo Ghosh as principal, was a famous example, nurturing free minds.
Taking control of the narrative, shaping the next generation. What else?
Fourth, that emphasis on self-reliance, Atma Shakti, extended to practical things. Village uplift programs, setting up local arbitration courts to bypass the British system, building strong community organizations, building parallel structures.
In the use of festivals. That seems quite innovative.
Extremely innovative. That was Tilak's genius, really.
Yeah.
Using popular Hindu festivals like Ganapati Puja and Shivaji Jayanti events, people were already connected to as platforms for nationalist messages, reaching the masses who didn't read newspapers, a powerful fusion of culture and politics.
Clever. And finally, the economic side. Swadeshi industries.
Yes. Fifth, the call for Swadeshi directly spurred the establishment of Swadeshi industries. Textile mills, match factories, soap factories, tanneries, a real surge in indigenous enterprises. The goal was economic independence, break free from reliance on British goods.
So a really comprehensive program, economic, cultural, political, and it clearly sparked new forms of struggle, brought new people in.
Absolutely. That's one of the most striking things about the Swadeshi movement who got involved. Students were right at the forefront, organizing pickets, spreading propaganda, volunteering for national schools. Huge energy.
And women.
A massive step. Women came out into the public sphere like never before, participating in processions, picketing shops, selling foreign goods, actively promoting Swadeshi at home. It really marked their entry into mainstream nationalist politics, shattered traditional boundaries.
A huge social shift alongside the political one. What about workers?
Workers also got involved, though maybe more sporadically. There were strikes, government presses, railways, jute mills. Leaders like Ashwini Kumar Banerjee helped organize them. It showed the movement was starting to reach beyond the middle classes.
And it wasn't just Bengal, right? It spread.
Definitely. It became an all-India movement, at least in spirit, and reached to key centers. Punjab had Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh. Pune and Bombay had Tilak driving it. The Draws had Chidambaram Pillai. Delhi had Sahyada Raza. It wasn't uniform everywhere, and mobilizing peasants remained a challenge, but the message resonated far beyond Bengal. Tilak saw it as a new chapter for the whole country.
Despite all that energy, the partition was eventually annulled in 1911. Why did the British reverse course? Was it because the movement succeeded?
Well, yes and no. The annulment wasn't really a straightforward victory for the nationalists or a concession to their demands. It was more of a strategic shift by the British.
What was the strategy then?
Primarily, it was about curbing the rise of revolutionary terrorism. The Swadeshi movement, especially in Bengal, had seen a significant increase in violent activities, making the region very unstable. The partition had inadvertently fueled this, so annulling it was partly an attempt to calm things down.
And consolidate control.
Exactly. Consolidate control, appease certain sections, maybe try and win back some goodwill. Although it backfired with some groups, particularly the Muslim elite in East Bengal, who felt betrayed.
And the capital shift from Calcutta to Delhi happened around the same time. Was that related?
Yes, shifted in 1911, too. Moving the capital out of Calcutta, the hotbed of nationalism, was definitely part of it. Delhi had historical links to Muslim rule, the Mughal era, so it was partly seen as a gesture, a sop to the Muslims, as the source says, to offset the annulment. Didn't fully work, though.
And Bengal itself was reorganized again.
Right. Bihar and Orissa were separated. Assam became its own province. So, while the original partition was undone, Bengal was still reshaped, its political weight may be reduced in a different way, still serving imperial aims.
So the movement fizzled out before the annulment, but historians still see it as hugely significant, a turning point.
Oh, absolutely. Despite not achieving immediate Swaraj and eventually declining, it's seen as a critical leap forward. Its long-term impact was immense.
What makes it such a leap forward, then?
Several things. First, that broader participation we talked about, students, women, workers, parts of the rural population, it showed mass mobilization was possible. Second, the emergence of diverse political trends, moderation extremism, revolutionary ideas, passive resistance, they all really came to the fore during this period. It was a melting pot of strategies. Third, the cultural and scientific enrichment. Tagore's songs, like Amar Sonar Bangla, became anthems. New scientific institutions were founded. A flourishing of arts and literature focused on Indian themes, boosting national pride. Fourth, it provided vital political education for the masses, teaching bolder forms of protest.
And fifth,
crucially, it seriously undermined colonial hegemony. It chipped away at the British narrative of being benevolent rulers. More and more Indians saw them simply as foreign exploiters.
a powerful legacy. But it did fizzle out. Why did it lose steam?
A combination of factors, really. First and foremost, brutal government repression. The British hit back hard with those repressive laws we touched on, the Seditious Meetings Act, the Press Acts targeting leaders.
Made open agitation very difficult, very risky.
Exactly. Then there was a lack of effective, unified organization to sustain that level of mass mobilization over a long period across the whole country. Leadership was strong, but sometimes divided or localized.
And the social base wasn't always broad enough.
While it expanded significantly, it still struggled to consistently bring in the peasantry in large numbers or large sections of the Muslim community, partly due to British divide-and-rule tactics. And ideas like passive resistance remained largely theoretical, not fully implemented on a mass scale yet.
Plus, it's just hard to keep a mass movement going at that pitch indefinitely.
Inherently difficult, yes. Without a strong, unified structure and clear short-term wins, the energy eventually dissipates, especially under heavy repression.
Which leads us right into another major event of this era, the Surat Split in 1907. The Congress tearing itself apart just as things were getting intense. What was the core ideological divide?
It had been brewing for years. Fundamentally, the moderates believed in gradual change, constitutional methods. Their goal was self-government, yes, but within the British Empire. They still had some faith or hoped that Britain would eventually grant reforms if they petitioned correctly. Reformists, basically.
Whereas the extremists...
The extremists had completely lost that faith. They believed British benevolence was a myth. They wanted Swaraj, full self-rule, possibly outside the empire entirely. And they believed it required more aggressive, direct action boycott, passive resistance. They rejected the political mendicancy approach.
Two very different philosophies. How did this play out at the Calcutta session in 1906, the year before the split?
Calcutta in 1906 was interesting. The extremists actually managed to get resolutions passed supporting Swadeshi, Boycott, and national education, a big win for them.
How did they manage that?
Largely because Dadapai Naoroji was the president. His huge prestige meant neither side wanted an open fight under him. He even used the word Swaraj from the Congress platform, a concession to the extremists.
But it didn't solve the underlying tension.
No, if anything, it sharpened it. The moderates were uneasy, wanted to water down those resolutions later. The extremists felt emboldened, wanted to push things further. Both sides dug in. A showdown was becoming inevitable.
And that showdown came at Surat in 1907. What were the specific flashpoints that made compromise impossible?
3 key things. First, the venue. Extremists wanted Nagpur, Tilak's stronghold, so they could likely elect him, or Lajpat Rai president. Moderates cleverly maneuvered to have it in Surat, knowing the local leader, Tilak, couldn't be president there by convention.
Tactical move.
Very tactical. Second, the presidency itself. Extremists pushed for Tilak or Lajpat Rai. Moderates insisted on the more conservative Rash Behari Ghosh. It became a proxy fight for control.
And the resolutions.
That was the big one. Moderates wanted to backtrack on or dilute the Calcutta resolutions on Swadeshi, boycott, national education. Extremists demanded they be reaffirmed, even strengthened. Neither side would budge. Chaos erupted, shoes were apparently thrown, and the Congress formally split.
A dramatic and damaging outcome. What were the consequences?
Severe. The moderates were left in control of the Congress shell, reaffirming their loyalty to constitutional methods within the empire. But the split badly weakened the nationalist movement overall.
How so? Both sides suffered.
Yes. Moderates lost the energy and mass connection the extremists brought. They seemed increasingly out of touch. Extremists, now outside the Congress structure, lost that organizational umbrella and became much more vulnerable to government attacks.
And the British?
The British, naturally, exploited the division brilliantly, played one side against the other. Looking back, you see a real lack of foresight from both nationalist factions.
In what way?
Moderates could have used their position to shield the extremists somewhat from repression. Extremists could have provided the mass base the moderates lacked, but they couldn't see past their differences. It was a major setback, leading to a bit of a lull in the mainstream movement.
And the government moved quickly to capitalize on this weakness, targeting the now isolated extremists. What was their strategy?
A classic carrot-and-stick approach. Crush the extremists completely, isolate them, and try to rally the moderates and certain Muslim groups to their side with minor concessions.
So repression first. They brought in new laws.
Yes. A whole raft of repressive legislation between 1907 and 1911 designed to choke off any form of militant activity.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. The Seditious Meetings Act, 1907, basically banned public gatherings they didn't like. The Indian Newspapers, Incitement to Offences Act, 1908, let them seize printing presses for objectionable material, a direct hit on the nationalist press.
What else?
The Criminal Law Amendment Act, 1908, made prosecuting political offenses easier. The Explosive Substances Act, 1908, targeted the revolutionaries, and the Indian Press Act, 1910, tightened the screws even further, demanding security deposits from publishers. It created a legal dragnet.
Systematically closing down avenues for dissent. And they went after leaders directly. Tilak, most famously.
Tilak was the prime target. He was tried for sedition in 1908 over articles in his paper Khazari that commented on bomb attacks by revolutionaries in Muzaffarpur.
What was his defense?
He was defiant. In court, he basically said, look, if you use Russian methods of repression, don't be surprised if Indians start using Russian methods of resistance. He argued the real way to stop bombs wasn't repression, but granting Swaraj.
Incredibly bold, blaming the government's own actions.
Extremely bold, but it didn't work in that courtroom.
What was the sentence and the impact?
He was found guilty, sentenced to 6 years transportation exile, essentially to Mandalay in Burma, a massive blow. With Tilak gone, other tea extremists faced intense pressure. Aurobindo Ghosh retired from politics for spirituality. Bipin Chandra Pal also withdrew for a time. Lala Lajpat Rai went abroad.
So the leadership was effectively dismantled.
Largely, yes. Without their main leaders, facing harsh laws, and lacking that Congress structure, the extremist movement couldn't sustain itself organizationally. It led to that period of relative quiet, with the moderates controlling a weakened Congress. The government's strategy seemed successful in the short term.
And then came the carrot part of the strategy, the Morley-Minto Reforms of 1909. Were these genuine reforms or something else?
Definitely something else. They weren't about genuine power sharing. They came after the crackdown on militants. It was part of that benevolent despotism idea, offering small concessions to appease the moderates who still believed in the British system, and crucially, to woo sections of the Muslim community, further dividing the nationalist forces.
Tactical maneuvering, not real change.
Exactly. Maintain control by managing dissent, not by actually giving up power.
So what did the reforms actually do? What were the key provisions?
Okay, key points. 1, they increased the number of elected members in legislative councils, both central and provincial. Sounds good, but
There's always a but.
elected members were still outnumbered by officials and nominated members, especially at the center. So, no real Indian control. 2, elections were introduced, but they were very indirect. Local bodies elected colleges, which elected provincial members, who then elected central members. Very complex, very little accountability to ordinary people.
Okay, what else?
3, and this was huge and deeply controversial, separate electorates for Muslims, giving them representation often beyond their population share, with lower voting qualifications. This institutionalized communal division in politics, classic divide and rule.
A deliberate move to split Hindus and Muslims politically.
Absolutely. 4, legislative powers were slightly increased. Members could discuss the budget more, ask questions, pass resolutions, but the resolutions weren't binding. They could talk, but not really do anything substantial, no control over the purse strings.
All bark, no bite.
Pretty much. And finally, 5, an Indian was appointed to the Viceroy's Executive Council for the first time, Satyendra Prasad Sinha. Symbolic, but one voice among many British ones, little real influence on major decisions.
So the overall evaluation is not much substance, just a shadow.
A shadow, rather than substance, sums it up perfectly.
Hmm.
Historians agree they offered minimal real power. Legislators had representation without responsibility, leading to frustration and, as some noted, thoughtless criticism, since their votes didn't have real consequences. The main goal wasn't empowerment, it was division. Especially that Hindu-Muslim divide via separate electorates. It set a dangerous precedent.
A really crucial point, even reforms could be tools of control. Which brings us back nicely to summarizing those core differences between moderates and extremists that define this whole era. Ideology and goals first.
Okay, moderates believed in gradual reform, constitutional methods, goal, self-government, dominion status within the British Empire, faith in British justice. Extremists lost faith in British goodwill, goal, complete Swaraj, self-rule, potentially outside the empire, believed in aggressive agitation, direct action.
And their methods and strategies reflected this.
Completely. Moderates, petitions, prayers, protests, public meetings, press campaigns, appeals to British Parliament. Persuasion, extremists, Swadeshi, boycott goods institutions, national education, passive resistance, promoting self-reliance, Atma Shakti, using traditional festivals for mass mobilization, confrontation, and self-assertion.
Which naturally appealed to different groups, their social bases.
Right, moderates. Mainly educated middle-upper classes, professionals, lawyers, doctors, intellectuals, urban-centric. Extremists sought broader support students, women, lower middle class, sometimes workers in rural populations, used vernacular languages, popular symbols, aimed for mass involvement, though limitations remained.
And the key leaders embodying these approaches.
Moderates. Dadabhai Nauroji, though a bridge figure, G.K. Gokhale, Surendranath Banerjee, Firoz Shah Mehta, the elder statesmen. Extremists. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lokmanya, Lala Lajpat Rai, Lion of Punjab, Bipin Chandra Pal, Aurobindo Ghosh, early phase, the fiery, charismatic figures driving the new wave.
So pulling it all together, this era of militant nationalism, despite the splits and setbacks, it really changed the game for the freedom struggle, didn't it?
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
It shifted the whole movement's center of gravity. From polite requests to assertive demands for Swaraj, the Swadeshi movement especially proved mass mobilization was possible on a scale never seen before. It showed ordinary people could be part of the struggle. That lesson was vital for the future, for the Gandhian era.
So even the challenges, the repression, the split, they served a purpose in shaping what came next.
In a way, yes. It laid the groundwork for a much stronger, more widespread anti-imperialist feeling. The experiences, the successes, and the failures taught valuable lessons about strategy, the need for unity, the limits of constitutionalism against raw power, and the absolute necessity of mass participation and self-reliance. It was a crucial, formative, and ultimately transformative period.
It really highlights how complex the journey to independence was. This is just one vital chapter in our Navigating Modern India series, but understanding the shift towards assertive nationalism is so important, whether you're studying for exams or just want to understand India's story.
Absolutely. And maybe something for you, the listener, to think about is how these intense periods of debate, these shifts in strategy, even the moments of division, ultimately contribute to the bigger picture of a nation finding its way. How did the very ideas and methods forged in this turbulent era, even the ones that seemed to fail at the time, end up fueling the movements that came later?
A great question to reflect on. We hope today's discussion has shed light on this pivotal era of militant nationalism. Please join us next time on the Book Triangle podcast as we continue digging into modern India by Spectrum. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Keep learning.